We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air.
We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be.
What?
We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Winston Churchill, a name that echoes through history as Britain's greatest wartime leader, a statesman, an orator, a man who stood against Hitler when others wavered. But history is rarely as simple as the stories we are told. This is the real story of Churchill, as exposed by the likes of Tariq Ali and many others. Behind the celebrated image of Churchill lies a far more complex and deeply controversial. That is, if you believe perpetuating genocides and apartheids around the world are controversial, legacy. A legacy of empire, colonial violence, and decisions that murdered millions of lives, much like another contemporary infamous leader.
Du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
As much as it fits the character, these are in fact not the words of Hitler but of Churchill. Although in Mein Kampf, Hitler praises the way the quote-unquote Aryan Americans had quote, gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000, unquote, viewing it as a precedent for acquiring new territories. Both men believed in the supremacy of their nations, both saw war and expansion as necessary for their people, and both justified racial hierarchies that led to suffering across the world. Churchill defended the British Empire's right to rule over what he called lesser races, while Hitler sought living space for Germans, inspired in part by American westward expansion.
Then he asked someone sitting next to him at dinner, "Do you think the famine in Bengal is bad?" He said, "Yes, it is." And Churchill said, if the famine was that bad, how come Gandhi is still alive?
So, where do we draw the line between imperialism and fascism, between necessary conquest and unforgivable genocide? To understand Churchill, we must first understand the world he came from. Born in 1874 into an aristocratic family, Churchill's worldview was shaped by the height of the British Empire. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was deeply involved in imperial politics, and young Winston inherited not just his political ambition, but also his unshakable belief in Britain's divine right to rule over other nations, much similar to Hitler's idea of the superiority of the German race.
The famine in Bengal, 3 million dead. The assault during the Second World War on the Greek resistance, which is one of the more horrific acts carried out by the British in Europe during the Second World War. And this attack led to numerous deaths, led to a civil war in Greece. And at the height of the British attack on the Greek resistance, which was led by communists, they used to sometimes chop off the heads of members of the resistance, put them on poles and hold them outside prison camps. And when asked, why are you doing this? They said, this is what these people are used to. So the history of Churchill in Greece, the history of Churchill's intervention against the Bolshevik Revolution in its early years, which resulted in mutinies and which resulted in a very senior South African officer being court-martialed for refusing to carry out orders to use chemical weapons against Bolshevik villages and related matters. All this we didn't know. I mean,
at home, he wasn't any better. During Tony Pandy riots in 1910, as Home Secretary, Churchill authorized the deployment of troops as well as a battleship to crush the Tony Pandy miners' strike. The decision to deploy troops in South Wales to control striking miners led to violent clashes and excessive force. Many Welsh workers viewed this as a betrayal, fostering long-lasting resentment towards Churchill. His actions during this time remained yet another showcase of his fascist legacy. Churchill was never just a war leader, he was a devoted imperialist. His speeches, writings, and policies all revolved around one idea, that Britain's dominance over its colonies was both a necessity and a moral duty. In 1937, as the Arab revolt raged in Palestine, Churchill stood firm in Parliament. He demanded Britain honor its 1917 pledge for a Jewish homeland, rejecting Arab majority rule. To him, a future Jewish state meant prosperity for Palestine. In response to the conflict in Palestine, he said, "I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger. Though he may have lain there for a very long time, I do not admit that right. I do not admit of, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to those people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, or at any rate a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. I do not admit it. I do not think the Red Indians had any right to say, American continent belongs to us and we are not going to have any of these European settlers coming in here. They had not the right, nor had the power." One of the darkest stains on Churchill's record is the Bengal Famine of 1943. While millions of Indian civilians starved to death, Churchill's government refused to send essential food supplies, despite having the resources to do so.
Even after it had become clear that there was a famine in India, this is what is really shocking. Around the end of July, it was clear that there was a famine, and the Viceroy of India started asking for grain from the War Cabinet, which controlled all the shipping in the region, including Indian shipping. So there was some 80,000 tons of Indian shipping that was also being controlled by the War Cabinet. And they asked, can you release some of this shipping? And they said no. And one of the things I look at very carefully in my book was it possible to release shipping at this time? And the answer is that at this time, the British had managed to get a lot of ships from the US. So although ships were being destroyed in the Atlantic, the production of ships in the US was really massive, really. And the British had managed to get an assignment of ships for the British Empire's needs. But Churchill was not willing to release these ships to carry grain from Australia to India. They wanted to preserve both the ships and the grain for future use. They weren't even really needed for the war effort at this time.
So, Churchill's policies actively worsened the famine. He prioritized stockpiling grain for British soldiers and refused to divert food supplies, blaming the famine on Indians themselves, saying it was their own fault for, quote-unquote, breeding like rabbits. The Bengal famine wasn't just negligence, it was colonial policy in action. Churchill viewed India as a resource for the empire, not as a nation of people with rights. Churchill's views on race weren't just outdated, they were extreme even by the standards of his time. He openly supported racial hierarchies, describing Africans as a barbaric and inferior race. In Kenya, he backed violent crackdowns on the Mau Mau uprising, and in South Africa, he defended racial segregation.
What Britain did in Kenya, which he calls the British gulags. You know, that they locked large numbers of Kenyans up. The plan was to make Kenya into another South Africa, to introduce large numbers of white settlers, give them the best lands in the country, and so create a situation where the whites dominated Kenya permanently, or so they thought. They could never achieve that.
For Churchill, empire and race went hand in hand. He dismissed the idea of Indian independence, describing Gandhi as a half-naked fakir, and insisting that British rule was necessary to keep order. Despite his flaws, Churchill's role in the Second World War is undeniable, so it is said. His speeches inspired the nation, and his defiance against Hitler was crucial in Britain staying in the war. But even here, his record is more complicated than we often hear. His unwavering opposition to fascists in Europe was not as unwavering as his supporters claim.
You and those bastards, 6 o'clock high, coming down, now.
Roger, Red 3, I see him. Rabbit, straight right and climb.
Churchill viewed fascism not as a mere ideology but as a force, a raw extra-parliamentary current, armed and disciplined, capable of crushing the communist threat. On this point, he was unwavering until 1937, when the British Empire was threatened. His admiration for Mussolini was not just approval, but fervent endorsement. His faith in Franco endured even after the war's bloodshed had settled. For a time, he even looked upon Hitler with a sense of reluctant intrigue, impressed by the rigid discipline and fervent nationalism of the Hitler youth. But Churchill's relationship with fascism did not end with his battlefield defeat. As the war faded into history, he saw in its remnants a new utility. Former fascists were not disregarded, but repurposed, their expertise sharpened into weapons for the next great struggle. In the shadows of a new conflict, they were enlisted to safeguard Western colonial rule in Asia and to hold Greece in submission. Across Germany, Italy, and France, the very man who had once served totalitarian regimes, police chiefs, military officers, intelligence operatives, judges, and magistrates, were quietly restored to power, their past scenes overlooked in the name of a new war, the Cold War. Churchill also had his fair share of military failures. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign in World War I, which he orchestrated, led to over 250,000 Allied casualties. His leadership wasn't always the heroic, decisive force we remember today. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was crumbling, but Winston Churchill and the Allies were determined to accelerate the end of the war. One of the most debated decisions of this period was the bombing of Dresden, a German city known more for its cultural significance than its military strength. From February 13 to 15, 1945, British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on Dresden, creating a firestorm that killed tens of thousands of civilians. Churchill initially justified the attack as a military necessity. Dresden was a key transport hub supporting German troop movements. However, as reports of the devastation spread, Churchill distanced himself from the operation. In a memo written weeks later, he called for an end to the quote-unquote bombing for terror, signaling unease over the scale of destruction. However, he never distanced himself from war crimes against non-Europeans, once again showcasing his white supremacy. After the war, Churchill was voted out. Why? Because the British people, exhausted from war, rejected his conservative policies in favor of a new social contract. The Labour Party introduced the National Health Services and a welfare state, things Churchill opposed at the time. Churchill, however, had further opportunities to commit war crimes in the name of the British Empire. During his second term as Prime Minister in the 50s, his tenure overlapped with the Malaya emergency and the Mau Mau uprising, where over 11,000 and 60,000 people were killed respectively. He also played a key role in the 1953 coup in Iran, which overthrew the democratically elected government in order to reverse the nationalization of oil. The world was changing. The empire Churchill fought so hard to preserve was collapsing. By the 1950s and 60s, countries across Africa and Asia were winning independence, proving that Churchill's vision of Britain's global dominance was outdated. So why is it that influential figures such as Piers Morgan still cling on to his misrepresented legacy?
So Winston Churchill is almost unanimously regarded as a hero in Western society, not least by me. In fact, I think, like a lot of people in this country who voted him the greatest ever Briton, that he is indeed the greatest of all of us here, ahead of Shakespeare, Charles Darwin, Sir Isaac Newton, the Beatles, all of them.
Such statements reveal more about Churchill's supporters than about Churchill himself. Anyone who refuses to condemn such a legacy is in fact endorsing Churchill's crimes, crimes that are still being perpetuated on the global south. What do you think of Churchill? Let us know in the comments below.